Same plane, flight attendant CC Ross Lyles spoke a few words to her husband, telling him how much she loved him and their boys. Her last words were, "We've been hijacked." There were frantic calls in New York too. Amongst the thousands of personal accounts emailed to BBC News Online was one describing how a man on the upper floors of the World Trade Center, knowing he wouldn't survive, had called his wife to say goodbye. Another email described watching people have nervous breakdowns on the street as they frantically tried to reach loved ones by mobile phone. One Irish family had bittersweet news. A brother escaped from the World Trade Center.
Unfortunately, when he was okay, he said that he had a feeling his sister, my sister, had left Logan Airport to go to Los Angeles with her daughter around 7:30 in the morning. So we were then concerned that my sister could have been on either of the two flights that crashed into the towers.
It was confirmed his sister Ruth and niece Julianne had been on the plane. Mike Baker, BBC News.
The shock of what happened on the east coast of America has been sinking in right across the rest of the United States. Our correspondent David Willis has been to Utah and the American Midwest to assess reaction there.
There are reports of people calling for help from...
America awoke this morning and its worst nightmare hadn't gone away. Stunned, humbled and scared, now people here have started to reflect.
It changed the whole mood of the country yesterday. I haven't seen that. I don't think I've ever seen that since the Kennedy deal, Kennedy assassination. It has the same effect. It's making everybody very, very introspective and kind of reassess their values.
In Salt Lake City today, the flags were at half-mast, as they are in every other city the length and breadth of the land. The famous Mormon Tabernacle Choir took part in a memorial service, and ordinary people grieved for those they didn't know. United in sorrow, this country no longer seems as invulnerable or as invincible as it did just a few days ago.
Lots of blood, huh?
Smaller towns have been inundated with offers of blood. People packed the corridors at Barstow Community Hospital near the California border, leaving staff overwhelmed.
They have specifically asked many that have called, too, if some of it will be going to the East Coast, and the blood bank is making arrangements for that right now.
In towns and cities across America, there is shock and there is outrage, but in particular, there is bewilderment. The most powerful country on earth has had its confidence badly shaken. David Willis, BBC News, Salt Lake City, Utah.
Now, a quick recap. President Bush has described the attacks on New York and Washington as an act of war against the United States. NATO has announced that it's invoked for the first time part of the alliance's founding treaty, allowing collective military action if one member country is attacked. Now we're going to round off this hour with some of the powerful and poignant images of the past 2 days.
This is a war. It's the way they see it. You can't see it any other way, whether legally that is correct or not.
The United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
The FBI says it's identified many of the hijackers responsible for the attack on America. The remaining 7 stories of the World Trade Center have now collapsed. The plane that hit the Pentagon is said to have been heading for the White House. And NATO says that if the attack came from outside America, it will be deemed an attack on the entire alliance. You're watching BBC World News. I'm Philip Hayton. More details of yesterday's attacks on the United States are emerging. The U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell says that the plane which struck the Pentagon may have been destined for the White House, that the presidential plane, Air Force One, was also threatened. The FBI investigation into who was responsible for the attacks has also been gathering pace. The FBI's director has said the Bureau has identified many of the hijackers and their associates in Tuesday's attacks, but has not yet made any arrests in the probe. In New York, the remaining 7 stories of the World Trade Center have now collapsed.
America woke up this morning to confront the second day of a nightmare. The majesty of the New York dawn and the ugliness of the smoke drifting over Manhattan's scarred skyline tell the world nothing will ever be quite the same again. All around the peeled remnants of the World Trade Center, night had been dedicated to rescue. But it was dispiriting work faced with a weight of masonry that suggests death, not survival. A very few survivors have been found in the ruins, but it will take weeks to establish the number and the names of the dead.
The best estimate that we can make, relying on the Port Authority and just everyone else that has experience with this, is that there'll be a few thousand people left in each building.
As well as those missing, at least 200 firefighters are now known to have died, as well as 260 emergency service workers. And of course, all those on board the planes were killed. With Tony Blair now fearful that hundreds of Britons are among the victims, most of the dead must still be buried. Only 55 bodies have so far been found in the New York rubble. Even so, at least 6 people have been dug out alive, and there are still tiny flickers of hope for a few more.
We do believe that there are still people alive in the rubble. There have been some indications of cell phone communications.
And today, new images of the attacks are still emerging. This was a maintenance crew on routine duty in Manhattan as the first airliner smashes into the World Trade Center. The second impact was just as destructive. Planes laden with aviation fuel made by the hijackers into guided missiles flown with terrible precision. The fallout, the dust and the debris from the fires and later the skyscraper's collapse literally chased terrified New Yorkers through their own city. It was an act of war, today's headlines shout, and few Americans would disagree. Some New Yorkers did come out to work, but the mood could not have been more somber.
My heart is just heavy. I just feel hurt, personally hurt. As if it happened to me, it was just tragic.
I just hope we respond quickly. I think there should be a military response.
President Bush shares that resolution. F-16 fighters escorted him aboard Air Force One immediately after the attacks. And now it's emerged the presidential plane and the White House were apparently on the terrorists' target list, which can only increase George Bush's determination to hit back hard.
This enemy hides in shadows and has no regard for human life. This is an enemy who preys on innocent and unsuspecting people, then runs for cover. But it won't be able to run for cover forever. This is an enemy that tries to hide, but it won't be able to hide forever. This is an enemy that thinks its harbors are safe, but they won't be safe forever. This enemy attacked not just our people, but all freedom-loving people everywhere in the world.
The challenge to the United States could hardly be greater, and George Bush is looking to his allies for support. The Pentagon in Washington was devastated by the third plane to hit. America's military headquarters is still being searched for traces of hundreds more civilian and service personnel who are missing.
So let's go find him. Come on.
Amid all this dreadful uncertainty in New York today, Brenda Schonholt set out with her daughters to look for her husband. He worked in the World Trade Center. She's heard no news of him since the attack.
We're asking everyone to move back.
Now, the people that were evacuated from the World Trade Center, where would they be right now?
Unfortunately, they are all over.
Officer, they're looking for their father, who was in the building.
I understand. Unfortunately, my wife is in the building, and I still haven't heard from my wife.
But with mobile phones finally working again, they heard of a sighting and then a reunion. Amid all the carnage and despair, at least a little space for happiness. And in Washington, still reeling from the onslaught, the members of the United States Congress regrouped after fleeing the Capitol yesterday.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
They sang in anger, sorrow and defiance as America sends the strongest possible signal it means to fight back. The next days and weeks take the United States and the wider world into uncharted territory. James Robbins, BBC News.
As the people of New York and Washington struggle to cope with the devastation, stories are beginning to emerge of the bravery of those caught in yesterday's attacks. In particular, tributes are being paid to the firefighters and rescue services in New York, many of whom lost their lives trying to save others.
With dawn, some measure of the damage. Fine silt and twisted metal, all that remains of the twin towers of the World Trade Center, the workplace of 50,000 people, until 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. No one knows how many actually died, only that hundreds perished because they went to rescue the injured and got caught in the aftermath. This is Engine Company 30, where every fireman died. Another team of fire crews is moving in to take the place of their dead comrades.
People are feeling like they lost their family, because everybody knows somebody that's been here, that at the fire and died. Brothers, friends, relatives, and it's the worst day the fire department has ever had.
Why are people moving here? Why has this fire department moved here particularly?
Because the companies that are here lost all their members in the engine and truck company.
And a city fearing the worst, a hushed New York with little moving apart from ambulances and police, and increasingly the occasional hearse. Doctors have not been working flat out, simply because the injured remained where they died. But a city queues to give blood. Blood donation centers have been crowded. Lines of determined people, angry people.
And I'm here because I love freedom and humanity. So help me, just like Pearl Harbor, there will be no compromise. This will not ever happen again.
Amid the unfolding personal tragedies, people here also feel outrage at an attack on a city they love. In that gap was the very symbol of New York, those two twin towers that were on T-shirts, the logo of this city, now not there, just a gap. Stephen Evans, BBC News, New York.
Well, Stephen Evans is now on the West Side Highway, the road running down along the west coast of Manhattan Island. He says the mood among New Yorkers has changed dramatically.
Something has changed in the last hour, and that is that this road, this carriageway, has had a stream of vehicles going in and a stream of vehicles coming out. And the people have changed as well. People are now out on the streets. They've been cheering people, cheering vehicles rather, as they go in. There was a moving moment about, I don't know, 5 minutes ago, when a single fireman walked in, pushing soft drinks, pushing bottles of water, and he was cheered, and he pulled his shoulders back and simply walked in. It was a very moving moment. What I think has probably happened inside that compound is that they have now decided that serious excavation, serious removal of rubble and the debris of that disaster yesterday can now take place. So we are now seeing serious earth removal. We are seeing a change in the pace of the operation, and we're also seeing a change in the emotion of the people. We had that silence, that somber, stunned silence yesterday. Today we have a defiant raucousness.
The rescuers seem to be making painfully slow progress, Stephen. We heard from the mayor earlier, I think about 50-odd bodies had been recovered and only a handful of survivors.
They are making painfully slow progress, but you have to remember that it was two buildings, two of the tallest buildings in the world, 110 stories, reduced. Rubble is too kind a word for it. I've seen that stuff. It's finer than rubble. It's shards of mangled metal, but basically just dust below that. They've clearly had to work out how safe things are. There are reports that one of the remaining buildings has collapsed. If that's so, my suspicion is that it was some kind of controlled collapse to get the thing down and get everything out, including, unfortunately and tragically, an awful lot of dead people.
We can see behind you, Stephen, all the people clapping the emergency services as they go past. What is day-to-day life like in Manhattan today?
It's been, the word that keeps cropping up is eerie. It has been eerie in Manhattan. An awful lot of the avenues going up this island have been closed just so that the emergency services can get through. People stand around and reflect. They look at those ticker tapes, those neon ticker tapes on buildings which give you news, the latest news. And they look up at them and you ask them, well, what do you feel about it all? Do you feel angry about it all? They do feel angry, clearly. There's not always an appetite for vengeance. There sometimes is, but not always. There is an awful lot of incomprehension. People simply can't understand why it happened. In a sense, it's very hard to understand still that it did happen. I know we know the thing is real, but personally, when I look at that aircraft go into that second tower, I still can't quite believe that it's real, that it's not some sort of movie image, that it's not some sort of toy going on. So you know something awful has happened, but another part of your brain doesn't quite believe it.
Stephen Evans in Manhattan. Tonight, NATO said that it considered the tragedy to be an attack on the whole alliance. Across the world, countries have been sending America messages of support, as well as stepping up their own security measures to prevent terrorist attacks hitting them. And here in Britain, Prime Minister Tony Blair said he was recalling Parliament on Friday.
Tonight, with all its flags at half-mast, and for the first time in its history, NATO has invoked its famous principle that an attack upon one is an attack upon all. If the Americans decide the terrorist strike came from abroad, all 19 countries are now potentially involved.
What happened to the United States yesterday could have happened to any of the other 18 members of the alliance. And it was with that vision in mind in 1949 that those who signed the Washington Treaty enshrined the principle of an attack on one is an attack on all. It's interesting that it has taken almost 52 years for that to be invoked.
The tone of solidarity with America was set earlier in London, when shortly before speaking to President Bush, Tony Blair called a press conference to announce that Parliament would be recalled on Friday.
I don't think there's any doubt at all that this threat is aimed at the whole of the democratic world. The United States has been singled out, but there is no doubt at all that these terrorists will regard us all as targets. And therefore it is important for us, whilst this has happened in the United States of America, to remember that very basic fact. This is an attack on the free and democratic world as a whole.
And that seemed an instinctive reaction across Europe, where there will be a 3-minute silence on Friday. France flooded airports and streets with soldiers and police, while there were, for once, pro-American demonstrations in countries like Germany. But the popular sympathy also spread far beyond America's normal allies. Russians in Moscow saw parallels with Chechen attacks there. While the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat even donated blood as a presumably symbolic sign of sympathy. And behind the immediate sorrow, the whole world is waiting to see how America, and now her allies, will respond. It's hard to imagine a more full-hearted expression of solidarity with America than NATO's decision tonight. But if these attacks do amount to a declaration of war, this is a war of a kind the West has never fought before. Andrew Marr, BBC News outside the Ministry of Defence.
The BBC's World Affairs editor, John Simpson, has just been to Afghanistan, and he's now in the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. He says the information reaching Pakistan was very contradictory.
Somebody from, apparently a messenger from Osama bin Laden came into the office of a newspaper here in Islamabad, which contained something which said, message which said that he hadn't actually been responsible for the atrocities in the United States. Well, there's even been some question about whether he wrote that particular piece of paper. As for the Taliban, they've been showing more signs of nervousness, perhaps, at the thought that where their guest might lead them, including a suggestion never properly underscored or reinforced later that they might be prepared to hand him over if necessary, and if the necessary evidence were produced by the Americans that he had indeed been responsible for the planning of the atrocities. Now, in fact, they offered something not very dissimilar 3 years ago, and so I don't think we necessarily need to assume that that's a genuine offer.
Where does Pakistan fit in all this? I think it's one of only 3 countries that recognize the Taliban. We heard Colin Powell saying a few hours ago that there have been low-level talks between the Pakistanis and the Americans, presumably the Americans asking for cooperation from the Pakistanis. Could they exert pressure on the Taliban? Is their relationship such that they could exert pressure on the Taliban to expel Osama bin Laden?
Pakistan could, if it chose to, exert a great deal of pressure on the Taliban, because really, essentially, it's Pakistan that keeps Taliban-ruled Afghanistan going with supplies of fuel, with supplies of all sorts of things which go across the border, food, water, even at this time of very serious drought in Afghanistan. So yes, in principle they could. In fact, I think there are signs that Pakistan is getting extremely nervous about being singled out as it were, a supporter in any sense of the Taliban, and I think we may see some movement here in the next few days.
John Simpson there in Islamabad. Let's go to the Pentagon now and join our correspondent John Lyon, who's there. John, we're expecting a visit from President Bush, aren't we? Has he arrived yet?
He's not only arrived, he's been and gone. We didn't see it from this side because he came in by motorcade at another entrance. We did see the extra security here, extra helicopters and obviously security guards posted. And one particular symbol that was unveiled for the President's visit, have a look behind me and you'll see a huge Stars and Stripes, which was just unveiled about an hour ago on the side of the building, just beside where the worst of the damage was, where that airplane hit. So that is obviously a huge symbol to America's enemies and to the American people that they're going to be undaunted by this attack.
Just tell us a bit, John, about what's going on behind you, the rescue operation in the Pentagon.
Well, we've actually just had a statement from the Pentagon which they said that anyone who might have survived the initial impact and collapse could not have survived the fire that followed. So they have announced that they believe there are no more survivors left in that building, and they've also said they believe this could take between 10 and 15 days to complete the rescue operation. Rescue, that is, sad to say, just the bodies.
And also tell us about the emerging evidence that the White House and Air Force One were targeted.
This is coming from a White House spokesman. They say they have credible evidence that the target wasn't meant to be the Pentagon, but was actually meant to be either the White House or Air Force One. This has come now from several sources. It had already been rumored at some stages yesterday, shortly after the attack, and has now been, if not confirmed, certainly strengthened by the White House sources. We don't know, of course, why they changed their target at the last minute. And the other curious thing about that is that for all the remarkable, sinister planning of these attacks, they hadn't worked out where the President was. He was in Florida yesterday morning, and there was no sign the planes were headed there.
Now, the officials are talking about numerous credible leads in their investigation. What do they mean?
Well, they're not giving us details, of course, but we do know about the operations going on in Boston. They've found, for example, the rental car they believe was used by one set of hijackers, things like instruction manuals
in Arabic on how to fly these models of airplane. So they're working through a huge host of clues. Obviously, they'll be looking at the manifests of who was on board those planes. So they've got quite a lot to work on now. And they've also, as I'm sure you've been reporting, made some arrests in Boston.
Thanks, John. The Attorney General said tonight that some of these suspected terrorists were trained as pilots in the United States. And he said that law enforcement officers had a number of credible leads. The FBI said they identified many of the hijackers and their associates, but had not yet made any arrests. George Eakin now on the investigation.
Boston this afternoon, and a raid on a hotel by heavily armed police. From searches like this, from the passenger lists of the doomed planes, from car hire companies and from the internet, America's law enforcement agencies say they're gathering a wealth of credible leads. Already they've identified many of the hijackers.
We also have identified through a number of leads, principally at the cities of origin, a number of individuals whom we believe may have had something to do with the hijackings, and we are pursuing those leads aggressively.
Investigators are already working at the 3 airports used by the suicide hijackers, whose extraordinarily tight timetable meant they had control of 4 aircraft in the sky inside 15 minutes, ensuring a sequence of attacks so rapid that the authorities had no time to respond. United Airlines Flight 175 from Boston to Los Angeles took off at 2 minutes to 8 in the morning. 1 minute later, an American Airlines plane, Flight 11, left, also bound for LA, with another hijacked team on board. 2 minutes after that, the doomed United Flight 93 to San Francisco set off from Newark. And at 8:10, the final hijacked team was airborne from Washington on board American Airlines Flight 77 to LA. It was the second plane to take off which hit the World Trade Center first. The earlier flight from Boston then came in from a different direction and struck the other tower. The flight from Washington looped back and crashed into the Pentagon. Finally, the airliner from Newark came down in rural Pennsylvania, possibly bound for the Camp David presidential retreat. The terrorists had done their homework. At least one of the airports they chose has been recently fined for poor security. To inflict maximum casualties, they targeted long-distance flights, with tanks carrying fuel for 6 hours in the air. Experts say the 4 hijackings were easy.
Security in America is, putting it probably lightly, is lax. In some places it's non-existent. Now, we're told these people only got on with knives, but knives are enough to control an aeroplane. And if you're determined, and it really depends on the determination of the hijacker, whether he takes control of the aeroplane. They obviously were very determined.
At Boston Airport, police seized a hire car with an Arabic language flight manual on the back seat. A video on how to fly airliners was also found. Those hunting them believe at least some of the hijackers learned to fly in America. Through their spy satellites and listening stations like Menwith Hill in Yorkshire, the American intelligence agencies are believed to have intercepted communications linking yesterday's attacks to associates of the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden. As many as 30 people may have been involved in the attacks.
The day-to-day organization of this, which will have taken months to set up, and the decision to go on the particular day at the particular time and to get all the timings right, that decision has to be made somewhere in North America. And it seems to me that there are a lot of American elements in this whole hijack drama. Whoever is ultimately responsible, a lot of the people who were involved in it were intrinsic to American society.
Investigators believe they know who many of the hijackers were, but pinpointing those who organized the mass murder is likely to take considerably longer. George Eakin, BBC News.
Now, a reminder of today's main developments. President Bush has described the attacks on New York and Washington as an act of war against the United States. NATO says that if it's confirmed the attack originated outside America, it'll be deemed an attack on the entire alliance. The FBI says it knows the identities of most of the hijackers responsible for the attacks. Some were trained in the United States as pilots. The mayor of New York says he fears thousands of bodies are still buried beneath the ruins of Manhattan. And the remaining 7 floors of the World Trade Center have now collapsed. This is BBC World News. Although many families are still desperately waiting for news of their relatives, some already know their fate. Today they told of some of the desperate final phone calls made by the loved ones from the hijacked planes and from the Trade Center. Mike Baker reports.
Mark Bingham was one of several passengers on the plane hijacked over Pennsylvania who managed a brief mobile phone call to his family.
He just said, "I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again."
He said that?
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, "Well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother."
With moments left, he described events on board.
There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, "Well, who are they, Mark?" And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, "I don't know who they are." He became distracted there as if someone was speaking to him, and then the phone went dead.
From the same plane, flight attendant C.C. Ross-Lyles spoke a few words to her husband, telling him how much she loved him and their boys. Her last words were, "We've been hijacked." There were frantic calls in New York too. Amongst the thousands of personal accounts emailed to BBC News Online was one describing how a man on the upper floors of the World Trade Center, knowing he wouldn't survive, had called his wife to say goodbye. Another email described watching people have nervous breakdowns on the street as they frantically tried to reach loved ones by mobile phone. One Irish family had bittersweet news. A brother escaped from the World Trade Center.
Unfortunately, when he was okay, he said that he had a feeling his sister, my sister, had left Logan Airport to go to Los Angeles with her daughter around 7:30 in the morning. So we were then concerned that my sister could have been on either of the 2 flights that crashed into the towers.
It was confirmed his sister Ruth and niece Julianne had been on the plane. Mike Baker, BBC News.
The shock of what happened on the east coast of America has been sinking in across the rest of the United States. Our correspondent David Willis has been to Utah in the American Midwest to assess reaction there.
There are reports of people calling for help from...
America awoke this morning and its worst nightmare hadn't gone away. Stunned, humbled and scared. Now people here have started to reflect.
It changed the whole mood of the country yesterday. I haven't seen that. I don't think I've ever seen that since the Kennedy deal, Kennedy assassination. It has the same effect. It's making everybody very, very introspective and kind of reassess their values.
In Salt Lake City today, the flags were at half-mast, as they are in every other city the length and breadth of the land. The famous Mormon Tabernacle Choir took part in a memorial service, and ordinary people grieved for those they didn't know. United in sorrow, this country no longer seems as invulnerable or as invincible as it did just a few days ago.
Lots of blood, huh?
Smaller towns have been inundated with offers of blood. People packed the corridors at Barstow Community Hospital near the California border, leaving staff overwhelmed.
They have specifically asked many that have called, too, if some of it will be going to the East Coast, and the blood bank is making arrangements for that right now.
In towns and cities across America, there is shock and there is outrage, but in particular, there is bewilderment. The most powerful country on earth has had its confidence badly shaken. David Willis, BBC News, Salt Lake City, Utah.
America still shocked and bewildered. That's all from the BBC World Newsroom for the moment.
You're watching BBC World. We bring you up to date with the latest financial news now in World Business Report.
This special edition of World Business Report brought to you as the world's financial community, which of course has been devastated, counts the cost of the aftermath of the tragedy that we have seen in New York and Washington. We will be going to New York in just a moment. In Europe too, we've had a reaction in Asia as well through the day. The global financial community has been devastated. Earlier in the day, traders in London observed a minute's silence as a mark of respect for colleagues in New York. Similar scenes to this. These scenes took place in London, and similar scenes took place at the same instant across Europe, exactly 24 hours from the moment that the first plane crashed into the World Trade Center. Well, as you can imagine, it's been a day of reaction right across the world. Despite the terrible loss of life in New York, this was a day that saw trading continue in other financial centers. Many international banks have shifted their operations away from New York to London or Tokyo. The big players in the global banking industry say that their systems have adequate backup and are secure.
Dealers at Cantor Fitzgerald in London are still in shock. They watched on television as the company's New York office was destroyed. Cantor employed 1,000 people on the 101st to 104th floors of the World Trade Center. Nobody in London knows who is dead and who is alive.
A feeling of total devastation of the loss of one's family. You can't blame them. They've known and dealt with these people now, many of them for up to 20 years, certainly between 5 and 20 years. Speak to them every day across the line in New York, work with them, trade with them, cooperate with them. They're family. And one day they're there and the next day they're not.
There are thousands in the square mile equally concerned about friends or colleagues in America. But business in the City of London has carried on. Transactions have been processed, share dealing has continued.
It turns out that the backup systems that many businesses have worked reasonably satisfactorily, and there's been an air of nervous calm, I would say, in the markets, but that has been modestly reassuring.
The backup systems the banks use are run by companies like Guardian IT. We were given access to one of their secure facilities. Entire trading floors stand empty and ready for emergencies, ranging from terrorist attack to simple computer failure.
Quite a number of our existing clients have put it on standby because they're concerned about security in this country. Also because some of the buildings, the key buildings in London have been evacuated as a precautionary measure, and therefore they put us on standby in the event that they may need to utilize the services we offer here.
Similar facilities are available in and around New York. It's likely all the major banks had their computer systems backed up on giant servers. The impact of the attacks on market sentiment and the economy will take a long time to assess, but technically financial markets are secure. Dealing will go on. Mike Sargent, BBC News.
Well, that was the scene in London, but elsewhere in Europe, the mood was also very somber. Our reporter Julia Caesar has been gauging the reaction of Frankfurt's business community.
It's been a grey and sombre day in Frankfurt as the city began to digest the enormity of the attack on America. Many of the skyscrapers and financial buildings here were evacuated. Workers are still in a state of shock, fearing similar attacks could happen in Germany.
Like business as usual, but if you ask people in there, they don't feel like business as usual.
I think it's difficult to work here, and I think I have a bad feeling in my stomach.
Who can do it? Who is able to do such things? We can't. We cried and it was not understandable.
Everybody who act in such a way, he is not allowed to be on this earth.
The International Motor Show had opened to the press as news began to come through about the attack. Television crews from around the world descended upon the Deutsche Börse, who made the decision to trade as usual at 8:30 Central European time. The major concern now is if the US slips into recession, the rest of the world will follow suit. The dollar's trading down against all currencies, and while the US stock exchanges are closed, others around Europe have held a minute's silence as a mark of respect. But trading in dual-listed companies has continued with no limiting in place in either France or Germany. The Deutsche Börse is also flying black Muslim on the flags outside the exchange to reflect the grief felt for those who've lost their lives. Like many other financial districts around the globe, Frankfurt's business centre has been subdued. It was trading as normal as the Deutsche Börse opened this morning, but without the usual gusto. Traders seem to lack the enthusiasm they usually have after the terrorist attack on America. Julia Caesar, BBC, Frankfurt.
I'm Patrick O'Connell in New York. We returned to where the story began, but we wanted to bring you news of where business had been done in the world. In a moment, I'll be joined by a senior economist here in New York and John Riding. And we want to remind you what this day has been about for New York business. One, stories of survivors being pulled for the rubble. Two, fears for those who have not been pulled alive. And three, a day of vastly reduced business. The stock markets here, as you will well know, were shut. First, though, we bring you this taste from the business community of Manhattan on this, the day after.
One day on, the smoke's still rising, the devastation still evident. Through a spattered lens, this camera caught the scene downtown near Wall Street and the scene where the World Trade Center had once stood. This entire area is a business community, and the word was going round that survivors were being found, alongside the many lingering questions about who will not be found alive. Just a couple of miles away, the Times Square area of Midtown, normally bustling with tourists and business people, now a shadow of its former business life. We spoke with people, business people, trying to go about their day. First, this man, a stranded businessman from Florida.
All the classes have been canceled, and I'm just kind of stuck in the city right now.
You're in common with a lot of